Hello and welcome to part 3 of our study in Matthew 16, 18, and 19, entitled, What is the Church? So again, these are the first verses in the New Testament where the church is mentioned. And so if we want to get a biblical understanding of what the church is and what the mission of the church is, then these verses are really important for defining that. So that's why we're focusing on these verses to figure out what the Bible really says about the church. In part 1, I talked about the word church itself, ecclesia in Greek, and we drew some implications from the etymology and the usage of that word, and we talked about why Jesus used that word for his assembly. And in part 2, we talked about Peter, his role within the church, and the phrase, on this rock I will build my church, and what that phrase actually means. So today, we're going to be focusing on the phrase, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, before we get started, just let me give you a brief summary of what's going on in this passage. So Jesus and disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, and he asks his disciples, whom do people say that I am? And they answer, some people say you're Elijah, or some Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And then he asks them, but who do you say that I am? And so then Peter responds and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that is when Jesus gives this response to Peter. He says, starting in verse 17, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. All right, so again, today we're going to be focusing on this phrase, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, when you and I hear this phrase, gates of hell, we probably think of, well, at least I think of, like the forces of Satan, like demonic forces are not going to overcome the church or take over the church or wipe out the church. And that's certainly an implication we could probably take from this. But what I really want to get at here is not what you and I think about when we read this phrase, but what is it that Jesus was thinking about when he said this phrase? And what did his disciples think of when they heard this phrase? What was their association with this phrase? Because if we understand that, then we're going to get the most accurate understanding of what this verse actually means. So, what all is included in this term, the gates of hell? Well, one other implication that we could take from this is just want to point out that gates of hell, although we might think of it in offensive terms, it's actually more of a defensive term. If you're behind a gate, you're in a protected place. This is a defensive position. And so this actually puts the church in the offensive position. They're the ones trying to break in and take over hell's domain, actually, rather than hell taking over the church's domain. So that's an interesting thought there. One thing that we could point out and look at. So this phrase, gates of hell, or gates of Hades in Greek, that'd be the Greek term there. There's a similar phrase that does occur in the Old Testament. So we're going to look at that here. It's in Isaiah 38:10. And so as you can see in verse 9 here, this is a writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after he'd been sick and recovered from his sickness. You remember from from 2 Kings, and also from, this would be in 2 Chronicles, I believe. Hezekiah became ill, and Isaiah was sent to him to tell him that he was going to die. And then Hezekiah prayed and asked God to allow him to live longer, and God told Isaiah, go back, tell Hezekiah that I've given you 15 more years to live. And so this is something that Hezekiah wrote after that when he recovered from his illness. And so he said, I said, in the middle of my days, I must depart. I am consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years. Obviously, he goes on there a lot, but you can see him describing sort of his doom to die. The fact that his death was imminent, he describes as being consigned to the gates of Sheol. And from this, we might conclude that, at least as Hezekiah is using it, he's talking about the certainty of his own death. We might even say that gates of Hades might represent the power of death. That's certainly an interpretation that a number of commentators take when we're looking at Matthew 16, 18, and 19. But these two verses aren't really that connected with Isaiah and the Matthew section. There's nothing literarily that causes us to really want to reference that passage in Isaiah, other than the fact that it's the same phrase that's being used. So I don't necessarily think we have a reason to believe that Jesus was specifically referencing Hezekiah's phrase there in Isaiah when he said this to his disciples. It's possible he did, but there's an even stronger connection, actually, that I want to show you guys that I think is just really, really fascinating. And to see that, we're going to have to go to Caesarea Philippi itself and talk a little bit about what was located in Caesarea Philippi. So what we're looking at here, this is not in Caesarea Philippi. This is the, I've got to read it here, the Darvasa Gas Crater, which is in Kazakhstan, also known as the Gates of Hell. And looking at this image, you can definitely see why it's called that. I'm not sure what is actually going on here that causes it to constantly burn like this, but it certainly looks like a gate to hell. But this physical location in Kazakhstan is not unique in being known as a gate to hell. In fact, in the Greek world, there were a large number of locations of caves or craters or something like that, which were known as gates to hell, or gates to Hades, rather, in Greek. And one of these locations was in Caesarea Philippi. This is the cave, which was in Caesarea Philippi, which was known as a gate to hell. This is modern-day Banias. It's called Banias after, it's a derivative from the Greek god Pan, and the reason its name was changed to Banias is because there was a temple to Pan right here, surrounding this gate of hell, this cave here. Here's another picture. This one's my picture. Now, in this picture, it doesn't actually look like it's a huge cave. It looks more like it's just a sort of a grotto there. It doesn't really go anywhere. This is not what the cave used to look like. Here's a picture of me with it, just right in front of that. There was an earthquake which altered the terrain of this area, and you can see how the earthquake tore the ground here, and some of the bricks have fallen. The earthquake also closed up this cave, but Josephus actually writes about this location in his Wars, in Book 1, Chapter 21, Paragraph 3. At one point in time, there was basically a cliff inside this cave. It continued forward, and then there was this huge drop-off, and there was a great underground water stream running down through here. And it was believed at the time that this underground stream was the source of the Jordan River. And so this was a temple of Hades, and this temple of, not a temple of Hades, a temple of Pan was built here, this temple complex, because in sites like this, in caves that were extraordinarily deep, which could not be measured, it was believed they actually eventually might wind up going to Hades, the realm of the dead. And so they would put sacrifices into these caves. They'd drop sacrifices of goats or whatever, down this precipice into the water as a sacrifice to the gods that they were dedicated to. In this case, to Pan, but also to Caesar. This here, as we can see, is an illustration of what this temple complex at Caesarea Philippi would have looked like back when it was actually all constructed. To the far left over here, this is a temple to Caesar Augustus, and this is directly in front of the cave. You can see the top of the cave right there, which is the Grotto of Pan. Over here, we have the temple court of Pan and the nymphs, and then next to that, we have a temple to Zeus, a court of Nemesis to the right, and then the tomb and temple of the sacred goats, and a temple to Pan and the dancing goats, number 7. That's, I guess, this area down here. So just a small temple complex here, which included a temple to Pan and as well a temple to Caesar Augustus. Here's some more pictures of that, some of the column work there. Here's a picture from what would have been the right side on that picture that we saw. The cave is right over here. The temple to Zeus maybe would have been right about here, and the platform where They worshipped Pan, it's right around this area. You see me standing next to that column. It's quite a bit bigger than you might have expected. Here you can see sort of the cutaways. This, I think, is right around the spot where that temple to Pan, or the platform where they had, which they had dedicated to Pan, and they would have put maybe statues of Pan or the nymphs or whatever they had in there in that little alcove. So it's a really fascinating place. And again, why is this all significant? So this place contains a gate to Hades, and you can just imagine the disciples standing there and Jesus standing there, and he's saying, "On you, Peter, I will build my church. I will build my assembly." And he points up the hill to this temple complex, and he says, "The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." And what is going on in the disciples' minds when he says that? Well, they know first two things. First, the pagan religions of the Roman Empire are not going to overcome Christ's assembly. Christ's assembly is going to overcome them. No matter what false religion it might be, they cannot stand up to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that doesn't mean that that Christianity is going to be the biggest religion. That doesn't mean that at all. It just means that these false religions are not going to stamp out true Christianity. And then, but the other aspect of that is that not only the power of pagan religions, but also the power of an antagonistic Roman Empire. Because this is not just a pagan place of worship, this is a place of worship for the imperial cult. We have a temple to Caesar Augustus right here. And so it's not just the power of like false religions, in my mind, what I'm thinking here, but the power of the state cannot stamp out the church. And I think of places like North Korea and China and Islamic governments across the world. Well, Islamic states across the world, is maybe even a better fit because you have both the false religion element as well as the oppression of the state. But his disciples are immediately going to be making these two, at least in my mind, it seems they have to make these two conclusions when they hear this. They're sitting in this city, looking up at this hill, and they know that temple to Caesar Augustus, that temple to Pan, that temple to Zeus, those things are not going to be able to compete with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is a really, really cool implication that I think it's just so cool when you make that connection and it opens your eyes to what Jesus is saying there. So I hope you got something out of that. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that encourages you as well as you think about just being a Christian in a world that is antagonistic against Christianity. So if you got something out of that, please like and share, and I hope you'll be able to join me for part 4, in which we talk about the keys to the kingdom of heaven.